Hi there, U.S. History students. Welcome. So today is going to be lesson 8.4. Our topic is still World War II, but we're changing our focus a little bit, and we're going to look at life on the home front. Life as it was experienced by Americans from 1940 or so to 1945, and what they experienced and felt. And you can see our targets here. How did the war change the American economy? We're going to look at the question of the treatment of Japanese Americans, but students, right now, I want you to take a very specific and particular look at this lesson through the lens of 2020 and through the lens of this COVID-19 crisis we're in. This is a strange moment. I just want you to have your eyes open for those parallels. I'm going to ask you about that again at the end, but that's the framework I want you to bring to this. This is dedicated to my grandparents who are both still with us. My grandpa's 95, my grandma is 92, 93, and yeah, Joe and Aurelia, and here they are, and this is that's 1944. That picture is taken. They've been married 75 years now, and God bless them. Anyway, I just want to say this one's for them. All right. So I think it's safe to say that aside from the Civil War, I mean, with all these like the biggest ever, the kind of discussions, you always have to take the Civil War and put that in its own category. But aside from the Civil War, World War II was the biggest collective effort that we've ever had to make. We are the most individualistic nation on earth, the most individualistic nation that has ever existed. I don't say that dismissively, and I don't really say that with a lot of criticism. I think that's one of the things that works about our nation. But we're not really a nation that is like particularly well suited to collective effort. What World War II showed us is that when that has to happen, we can do it. Right? And may it still be the case today. And that collective effort is done through work and sacrifice. It's done through making do with less. It's done through having to do extra to help everyone get through. And so famously, when we think about the sacrifices made in the war, of course, we think of the soldiers first and foremost. That's big. But then you think of people standing in line in a rationing board like this, dealing with rationed food and rationed supplies. And so this story is generally kind of a heroic story that I'm going to tell today, with a very bitter aftertaste, because we need to look at how a specific group of American citizens were treated or mistreated. That is a part of this, and so we'll get to that toward the tail end today. Let's start with the fun stuff. World War II is what kicks us out of the Great Depression. You remember that poisoned economic cycle that we looked at, and one of them is just businesses responding to a total lack of consumer demand. Well, now what broke that is there is massive consumer demand. All right, except the consumer is no longer really the American consumer. The consumer is now the government, or specifically the military arm of the government, saying we need every single military commodity we can get, right? And everybody goes to work doing this. And every company, it's like Ford. If you're an automobile collector and all you want is like a 1945, Ford, you're not going to get one, all right? They weren't manufactured that year or in 44, right? Because Ford is busy building tanks and Jeeps and trucks. By the way, a connection I just read today, which is March 30th, that I think it was Ford, but Ford and General Motors are now going to be making all sorts of ventilators for hospitals. And it's the same kind of idea. Like the government says, we need this. And so companies that normally manufacture this say, well, we're probably not going to have a lot of customers for that, so we're going to turn and produce that. And when you're producing all that, that means you need to hire workers. And so all these workers are getting hired again. And it's like the great American economy is starting to finally come back online. To his credit, FDR said, hey, if your customer is the American government and if you're producing for the war effort, we are going to insist that those factories be desegregated. That was not a fight that FDR needed to pick. He picked it to his credit to say, we're not going to take stuff that comes out of these sort of Jim Crow factories, and we're going to make sure that African Americans are going to get these jobs the same as everybody else. And so I'll note that, and we'll pick up the civil rights story in our next unit, but let's just note that as an early kind of shift, right? This image here is very, very famous, of course, Rosie the Riveter. And what this is sort of saying, this is the message to all Americans, of course. We can do it, meaning this collective war effort, but it's a specific message to women who are now being asked to do types of work that women have never been asked to do before, like heavy industrial work. And frankly, if I can be clear, I mean, for all the heroics on the battlefield, and those are major and not to be underestimated, and you guys understand I would never do that, but a huge part of the story of how did the Allies win World War II is American industrial output. That is a huge part of the story. And so, the industrial boom that we came out of this with was extremely potent. It finally did bring an end to the Great Depression. Joseph Stalin is not known as a great sympathizer to capitalism, right? Or the American economy. This is not, if you're sourcing this one, Joseph Stalin would not be a person you would expect to compliment that. Yet at the end of the war in 1945, he raises a toast with Winston Churchill and then Harry Truman. And he said, without American industrial production, the war would have been lost. That's a big deal. And so the American sleeping giant awakens, and Americans like to maybe sometimes think of that sleeping giant meaning like, our tough soldiers, our brave soldiers, and maybe to a degree, but like in a very real way, the sleeping giant was our factories. Where did all that money come from? The government. The government is spending it, and it's spending an enormous amount, more than the United States government had ever spent before. All right. World War II is the most expensive thing the United States ever did when you adjust the dollars for inflation, right? I noted this. If you took all the money the government had ever spent between 1776 and 1941, took that number, now double that, that's still not going to be as much as we spent in World War II, all right? And so how do you pay for it? Well, bonds. Bonds do pay for a lot of it. And again, bonds, they're encouraging Americans, propaganda efforts to get Americans to buy bonds, and then a lot of it's paid for with deficit spending. All right, meaning you borrow, and then you have to pay it off afterwards. Right, in our present crisis here, like we just passed a $2 trillion stimulus bill. I mean, our government was over budget in the first place, and we just passed $2 trillion more. That's deficit spending like crazy. We're going to have an insane budget deficit in 2020, and you say, well, it's an emergency. Well, what else can you do? When you say our economy is surging again, that was true for what that meant for Americans is they now had jobs. They now had steady paychecks. What they didn't have, and what we liked, but what they didn't have was stuff to buy, right? Americans didn't have stuff to buy because of where the economic focus is on producing military goods, right? And so there isn't an enormous amount of stuff that people can buy. And then other stuff like food or gasoline or rubber, all this other kind of stuff that you would buy or that would be part of the goods that you would normally buy, it's like, well, we need that for the war effort. And so what we have to do is ration those. And rationing efforts, it's like if you want to go out and buy a lot of meat or something like that, or gasoline, the question is not do you have enough money, it's do you have enough money plus do you have rationing coupons, right? And it's like these coupons you would get maybe once a year, and it's like you have to turn in this coupon when you buy gas, you have to turn in this coupon when you buy meat, and that will allow you, that's like your permission slip to get it. And the idea was, like it says here, rationing means a fair share for all of us, right? We don't all, without rationing, like there's only one pork chop left, says the butcher guy. But with rationing, now everybody gets a little bit, all right? Think today's day and age and think Purell, all right? Or think toilet paper. Now we're not doing rationing. Right now we're still relying on the market to provide it. And in part the market can provide it because everybody's not necessarily gearing up to produce, war machinery. But we are dealing with shortages of certain products, and rationing is one way of dealing with that. The public at home is barraged with propaganda, telling people to be quiet. Johnny might have sent you a letter saying, hey, Ma, we're here in Italy, and they say in a couple days we're going to be going to the city of whatever. And then Johnny shouldn't have told you that, but he did. And then Mom's like, oh, wow. and tells her friend that she sees at the grocery store about this. And then what do you know? There's a Nazi sitting right there in the produce aisle who overheard this, and now they know the whereabouts of Johnny and the whatever 82nd Airborne or something like this. I mean, it's a little bit far-fetched, but they were telling Americans, if you know anything about the war effort, just be quiet. We don't know where the eyes and the ears of the enemy are. All right? Encouraging Americans to produce, to work hard, saying don't call in sick. All right? Don't call in sick. Don't oversleep. We need everybody with their hand on the wheel in every factory in America to sacrifice food. And then there's also these uniting efforts that are ugly. One of the ways, not just in America, but everywhere else, that you can prove that you can unite people is by creating an other, right? And the focus of the other, like you saw in that video from last week, could sometimes be Nazi ideology, but oftentimes it was sort of a racial animus toward the Japanese. And of course, we'll see some evidence of it at home. Pearl Harbor shook people up pretty heavy duty. I think that's fair to say. And there was a fear among Americans, especially in the West Coast, that there would be more attacks, that Japan would be attacking again. All right, more attacks were coming. Maybe similar to what I recall after 9/11, when everyone felt like it was inevitable. There's going to be more attacks any day now. All right, and the fear was there's this 100,000 Japanese Americans living here on the West Coast, and do we know where their loyalties are? Do we know who they're really loyal to? Right? Most of these folks are American citizens. That's a really key part of this to note and to recognize. They're American citizens protected by the 14th Amendment that recognizes them as citizens and said they receive due process and equal rights under the law. All right? But still, right? What if they aren't loyal to us? What if they're loyal to their ancestral homeland instead of the place that they were born, or the place where they moved to and became citizens, right? And so there was just a fear that Japanese Americans would be disloyal, or that Japanese Americans would be spies. I want to say real quickly that was never the case. There's zero examples of a Japanese American citizen being a double agent, right, or being a spy. That turns out to have not been the case, right? I want to also acknowledge there's millions of Italian Americans and German Americans who didn't face the same level of suspicion, and certainly didn't face the same level of like government crackdown and response. All right, that was not something that was sort of pointed at people like my grandparents, right, who were German, right, and that's just not something that they experienced or faced. So in response to basically a lot of noise from people and politicians on the West Coast who said, we got to do something about these Japanese living here. Like, we're not sure, like, if we're safe if they're living here. We're not sure who they're really loyal to. In response to that, FDR signs an executive order. All right, this is not a law passed by Congress. This is just all on him. Executive Order 9066 that says all people who are of Japanese ancestry who live on the West Coast have to report to certain stations where they're going to be loaded onto buses. They can bring some luggage with them, and they will be sent to internment camps. This is, let's be clear, this is remembered as FDR's gravest error. A clear violation of the constitutional rights of 100,000 American citizens. And definitely done out of fear and political expediency, right? FDR basically calculates these people want that, and they're going to make a lot of noise and give me a lot of grief if we don't give them that. And are there going to be a whole lot of Americans who say, hey, and stand up for these people if we do this, or am I going to lose their vote? There's probably not that many of them, right? There's more of the people who are afraid and saying, get them out of here, so I'm going to politically listen to them. That's kind of what's going on here. So for these families, like the family you see pictured here, you see this notice, and it's like, you got to go, and everyone gets a suitcase or two, depending on the city. Every family member gets a suitcase or two, and you're put on a bus. And as it turns out, your home and whatever property you own, many of them own stores or things like this, those were vacated. Those were lost. All right, you just lost all that property and anything you'd built up and you get to keep whatever's in your suitcase, right? You're sent to camps. A lot of the times initially, when this happened in 1942, the camps weren't ready. So like many people were kept in horse stalls, for example, in Utah. But they're basically moved mostly to the Mountain West region, sort of the interior of the country, where they could be away from their Japanese spy contacts, right? That was the thought. They were held in camps. And, I'll be clear, these camps were not, Nazi death camps, all right? But you're surrounded with barbed wire and guard dogs and towers, and you didn't have clearance to leave, right? Internment camps is probably the correct term for them. And of course, nothing like this happened to German Americans or Italian Americans. So if you look, you can see like what one of these finished camps looked like. And they're basically like these army barracks, right? Except they're slapped up pretty fast, and they're in places like Utah, northern Colorado, where it gets cold in the winter. They're also American citizens, and so they would they would set up their own schools, and set up their own churches in these places, and set up and have sort of create their own civic communities, right? And try and carry on life as much as normal, as much as they could. Many of them even asked, famously, Japanese Americans asked for the opportunity to show their loyalty to the United States by fighting in the armed forces. And at first this was resisted, and finally it was allowed with the qualifier that they would fight in Europe, not in the Pacific. And they fought with great heroism and bravery. Here's an example of a man like this, Robert Kashiwagi. And he spoke much later. He spoke around, 2004, 2005. He gave this quote about what happened. He said, "As far as I'm concerned, I was born here, and according to the Constitution that I studied in school, I had the Bill of Rights that should have backed me up. And until the very last minute I got onto the evacuation train, I said, it can't be. How can they do that to an American citizen?" Guys, this is a story that is disturbing, and we've seen it before, right? Where in times of fear, we sort of say, well, this or that civil right, it's too dangerous a time to give people free speech. It's too dangerous a time to sort of let Japanese Americans have this or that. Much later, 40 years later, the United States government apologized and gave money to the survivors. Restoration work, as we might call it in our class and through our conversations. This is President Reagan saying, all right, the United States government will write checks for the property that was lost. All right, for the value for the wealth that was lost and the property that was lost back then. So that was issued to the survivors along with a formal apology from the United States government. 40 years later, but better late than never. What would you say here, guys? What are connections that you were able to make between life in America during World War II and life during our present difficult moment today? That's going to be your Flipgrid response that you'll go to next. I love this lesson. I'm sad I couldn't be there with you guys, but I'm happy to get to deliver it to you now, and I'm excited to see what you're going to say on Flipgrid. So that's it. Thank you guys so much, and we'll talk next time.